Welcome everyone to our Friday afternoon volunteer session. And again, we're doing this one a little different today. When we created the invitation, we created it in webinar, which is different in the way we've been doing it. So I don't get to see you, but hopefully you get to see me. And unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of me today because I didn't prepare a PowerPoint presentation. In fact, I started preparing for this program about half an hour ago, and Caitlin can verify that. So she is my witness. But in any case, I think it is really good that we're having a conversation today about the creation of Sarasota County, because Sarasota County was created 100 years ago in you know, 1921. We're coming on an anniversary of that, and it comes around once, it seemed to me that the volunteers of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens should have a little edge up on everybody else with a little bit of local history, things that you can, maybe some things that to read a book about Sarasota County, one called Creating Sarasota Dr. Frank. And this Dr. Frank, he sent here to Sarasota, did one called Suncoast Empire that was the nation of all of the active family here in the Sarasota and Florida region. That book was very popular, and then Frank immediately was inspired to create a book about the Sarasota. Okay, so I am back. I dropped off there. So I am back. And so you can read the book, which you can spend a nice weekend doing, or you can listen to me today. Those are your choices, or you can do both. So let's talk about just what was going on in 1921. So the president of our United States of America was Woodrow Wilson. The actual governorship of the state of Florida shifted on January 4th. Sidney Katz had been in for 2 terms, and he was term limited out at the beginning of 1921. And Carrie Hardee, who I believe was a native of Florida, was elected governor and was inaugurated on January 4th of 1921. Carrie Hardee was from the Democrat Party, and you might be intrigued to know that Sidney Katz was from the Prohibition Party. That was actually one of the leading political parties at the time to keep the men from drinking. And so if we were to compare the value of $1 back in 1921 to the value of $1 today, if we had $1 then, it's worth $14 today. Or maybe we should say that $1 today would have been worth $14 back then. So there's been just a little bit of inflation. Actually, the dollars themselves were larger. The paper money was larger than the bills that we have today. I always laugh when people complain about the new bills that come out because the pictures look different. They say they shouldn't change this American money, and yet American money's been changing through all the decades of this country. You might recall I talked about when John Webb was down here at Spanish Point at the beginning, there wasn't really any paper money in Florida. There wasn't even any coinage. It was all gold, Spanish money. But in any case, most people use the silver dollars. And in 1921, there were 2. There was a Liberty dollar, and then there was the Morgan dollar. And so you'd have those rattling around in your pocket. There were 48 states in the Union, and that had been that way since 1912, I believe. There was a lot of states added in over the years, away from the thought of creating more states and to just to what we're going through today, we had a bit of a coronavirus outbreak 100 years ago. And this was pretty much passed by 1921, but it was still very much on people's minds. And for those of you that know the history, you know that the fact that it was called the Spanish flu had nothing to do with it being started in Spain. It had everything to do with the fact that Spain was a neutral country in World War I, and they were the only ones that did not have a media blackout on any information about the flu. So Europe and United States had agreed not to talk about the flu in the news. So Spain was talking about it, and so everybody labeled it the Spanish flu. It actually started here in the US, was brought to Europe by our troops, and brought all back home when the troops came back. So America was recovering from that, and so that gives us hope that we will also recover from what we're experiencing now. Remember that last flu took 3 years, and so maybe we'll do a little better this time. So the population of Florida in 1921 was almost 1 million people, 997,000 people throughout Florida. And I tried desperately to find a racial breakout of that. It was very difficult. However, I think it's safe to say that the ratio of African Americans was probably around 30%. And it could have even been more at that time. The population of Sarasota was 2,149 people in 1921. Now, we have to kind of put an asterisk on that because of the fact that that could reflect the core of downtown Sarasota and not necessarily reflect places like Inglewood, Venice, Fruitville, Bee Ridge, Myakka, and et cetera. So we'd have to dig a little deeper into the census for 1920 to really tease that out. The other thing that's very interesting about 1921 and 2021 is that we are not the only county who are celebrating a centennial. Actually, 7 counties are. And so what happened in 1921, Union County was created out of Bradford County up in the central part of the state. And Union County is unfortunately most known as being the home of our state prison at Rayford. So that gives you a little perspective on where that is. And then Dixie County was created out of portions of Lafayette and Suwannee County. And so those two were kind of independently growing, and they felt that they had grown to the point where they too needed to create their own county, and so they did so. But an amazing thing happened with DeSoto County, which was a huge county. And DeSoto split off into Charlotte County, Hardee County, Highlands County, and Glades County. And then the remainder stayed as DeSoto County. So DeSoto County got hugely broken up. And DeSoto County had been around since, I think, 1878, maybe 1887. It's one of the two. And actually, when DeSoto split off from Manatee, which is what we were a part of, that created the line that we currently have down through the middle of Inglewood. And you might say, well, why did they draw a line through the middle of a town? Well, Inglewood wasn't there until like 10 or 20 years later. So if anyone in Inglewood ever says, well, you know, we got the county came in and put this line through us and divided us, that is not the case. Inglewood grew up right there on the border. Now, there's another county in Florida that's celebrating an anniversary this year, and it's an amazing anniversary. It's their bicentennial. Can anyone guess what county that is? It's Escambia County. Escambia County was created when Florida was still a territory in 1821. So I'm sure hoping they have a big party plan, because 200-year anniversary doesn't come around too often. And for people that think that Florida has like no history, to say, hey, Escambia County is celebrating 200 years is pretty darn cool. And then also the idea of Sarasota County celebrating 100 years is pretty cool too. So now let's talk a little bit more about kind of what was going on here in 1921 and what were some of the things going on. Well, you know, for one thing, Bill and Marie Selby had bought their property up there on Hudson Bayou in 1920, and they were building a very innovative masonry concrete block structure, one of the very first of the kind of Mediterranean revival style buildings anywhere in Sarasota, about 3-4 years ahead of everybody else with that style. So that's kind of interesting. So the next time you're sitting outside the Selby Cafe, keep in mind that that home was not just one of the hundreds of Mediterranean revival buildings with stucco walls and barrel tile roofs and archtop windows. That was one of the first. It was very innovative and it attracted a lot of attention at the time. So Manatee County at that time was 1,299 square miles in size, and approximately 52% of that was in what they called the Sarasota district. So there were 5 commission districts in Manatee County, and the way that they distributed the taxes was equally amongst the districts. So think about that. Sarasota district, which is what they called it, comprised 52% of the acreage of the mother manatee, and we got 1/5 of the taxes spent here because of their fair, equitable system of giving equal amounts of money to the different districts to support their schools and their roads. So you can imagine, I'm starting to plant the seeds for maybe what would have caused the people down here to want to create Sarasota County. And this was called South County. And the other districts were Parrish and Palmetto and Bradenton. And then they had one called Manatee, which at the time, Manatee was actually a town just a little east of Bradenton, has now kind of been swallowed up by it. But they used that to describe kind of the eastern hinterlands. And then there was this Sarasota one. Now in 1921, there were actually 4 paved roads in Sarasota, if you can believe that. And there are a lot of automobiles at this time, but there's only 4 paved roads. And one of those roads was what we would call the Tamiami Trail. And that road came down from Manatee, cut all the way through the county, a little bit different than it does today, zigzagging at Vamo Road, zigzagging at Bay Street and Old Venice Road, zigzagging all the way down along property lines that were straight instead of cutting a diagonal. And then years later, they came and straightened out those different areas and pushed Vamo out of the trail and pushed Inglewood out of the trail and all this as they kind of smoothed out the curve, so to speak. Those hard roads. Oh, and then there was the old road to Bradenton, which actually went partially along where Indian Beach Road and Bayshore Road go now, but actually was even closer to the bay. I recall I had a friend who had a house on the bayfront up there, and he had a hammock strung from one palm tree to another, and in between you could see the old route of the trail. It was just, the road was still there, and you could see it in everybody's yards. And that had been abandoned about 1916, but there were still portions of that were paved. And then there was Fruitville Road was paved out to what we now call the celery fields, what they called at the time Big Camp Sawgrass. It had not been developed in any way. Back in 1886, they had done some ditching there with horses and manual labor to begin to drain the sawgrass for agriculture. But that really didn't come to fruition until the Palmer Farms really cranked it up in the middle 1920s. So basically you had a road to Myakka that ended at the celery fields, and then you would have your horse and wagon, of course, to get out there, and you would send your children out ahead of you walking through the water of the marshes so that you could see where the deep spots were. And then when you got to the other side, they'd get back in your cart and you'd go to the next one, and then you'd have your kids walk in front of you there. Alligator bait. You also had Bee Ridge Road, which ran from where Tamiami Trail is now, east to Sawyer Road, and then south to Proctor Road, and then out to McIntosh. And so the center of Bee Ridge was McIntosh and Proctor, and that was paved to that point, and then it was just dirt roads from there. And then you had a little tiny piece of road that was called Bay Road. That's now where Sunset Chevrolet is, and that ran out to the bridge that went over to Siesta Key. That bridge had been built and put in about 1917. But by 1921, it was already in disrepair, and they had some issues there. So in any case, that was the state of roads and bridges. The school for Sarasota was a 2-story painted yellow wood frame building on Main Street. And there was a little school up here in Bayonne, what you now call Vamo. There were 2 schools in Bee Ridge that switched back and forth each year. They did the same thing in Inglewood, switching between Inglewood and Vineland schools. and you had little one-room schoolhouses, as they say, all over the county: Mayaca, Laurel, Nokomis, such. And so that's kind of the state of affairs. Um, but I need to back up, because if we're really going to talk about the history of the creation of the county, it didn't just happen in 1921. It's not like everybody woke up on July 1st, 1921 saying, yippee, it's Sarasota County. There were some things that started this all out at the beginning. And, you know, one of those big things was a gentleman came down from Chicago named Joseph Lord. And he started buying up a lot of property in Venice and what we now call Osprey, and basically bought up 37,000 acres south of what we now call Clark Road. And he owned all that, and he had a citrus grove that he planted in downtown Venice, which was called the Stone Grove. And the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers back in the 1920s uprooted those citrus trees and planted them along the roadsides of the modern city of Venice that they were building, but none of them survived. And then they brought in the California Washington palms that were there, Washingtonian palms that were there until just about 2 years ago, when they replaced all those in downtown Venice. So let's go back to, so that was the 1890s. And frankly, Lord was just sitting on this property, growing citrus, encouraging other people to move down here, taking out ads in the Chicago newspaper to attract people from the Midwest to come down here. And as the story goes, it was one of those ads talking about sunshine and orange groves and the bay that Bertha Honore Palmer saw when it was snowing outside, and it was the windy city, and the wind was cold and it's blowing all around her stone mansion there on Lakeshore Drive. And she's seeing this ad advertising sunshine for sale. And she decided to reach out to Joseph Lord, who had an office in the Marquette building in Chicago, and made arrangements to come down to Florida and check out this property. And then arriving in February of 1910 at the Seaboard Airline Railroad Depot, then conveyed down to the Bellhaven Inn at the foot of Main Street, where she took rooms with several members of her family. And then they fanned out throughout the area, looking at land and really taking in all the beauty of the natural surroundings, which is, you know, one of the things that she thought would attract people to follow her. And so therefore, this is what her development approach was based upon. So let's think about what was Sarasota like in 1910. 840 people in Sarasota in 1910. In fact, between 1910 and 1920, we had an average of 9% population growth every year. It was huge, even compared to what we see today as a rapid fire population growth. I don't know that there's any decade that really exceeded that type of year after year growth in that era. Even the Florida boom, where everybody talks about everybody coming here in the Florida boom. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of the people that were here for the Florida boom were already here by, say, 1920. And then the boom crashed here in 26, and so they left. And so if you looked at the over 10 years, I don't know that you'd even see that much growth. But between 1910 and 1920, tremendous growth. And you know, Mrs. Palmer, so really what we're talking about then is that this all started 111 years ago, because the creation of the county started the day that Bertha Palmer arrived in Sarasota. And it's interesting because right after she arrived, she summoned basically the Board of Trade, the members of the Board of Trade, which was an all-male organization of businessmen in Sarasota, and she summoned them to a meeting. And I'm sure that that's the first meeting of the Board of Trade that was ever attended by a woman. And in this case, it was hosted by her. And from what I know about that meeting, she basically shared her vision for the future development of Sarasota and shared with the Board of Trade what she intended to do, and basically suggested to them that it was time to get their act together, because they had kind of been up and down in terms of their activity in the last couple of years. But it was time to get organized and get it together. And so that's kind of interesting. Two other people became prominent in Sarasota in 1910. One was William Tuttle. William Tuttle was a surveyor that Mrs. Palmer had brought here to survey her property. And he would have a critical, pivotal role in the creation of the county 10 years later. And then the other was Rose Phillips Wilson, who had married Cornelius Wilson, and who had published a newspaper up on the Manatee River, and then in 1899 moved to Sarasota, where her and her husband published the Sarasota Times beginning on June 1st of 1899. And in the middle of 1910, her husband passed away. He wrote his final editorial and shared with the community that he needed them to support his wife in the continuation of the newspaper, because indeed she had been publishing it for several months while he had been sick. And so she was one of the only female editors in the state of Florida, and she was pivotal to the creation of Sarasota County and for getting out the vote of women. Because if you think about this, 1921, the vote to create Sarasota County was actually the second chance that women had ever had a chance to vote in Sarasota, and it really did bring out the vote. So 111 years ago, a woman comes to Sarasota, and 10 years later, the county is created. But let me tell you a few other things that happened in 1910, because it seems like things moved along pretty rapidly. By May of 1910, 4 months after she arrived, she had purchased all of Joseph Lord's 37,000 acres of land, making her immediately, the largest landowner in the area, particularly south. And again, that was basically everything from Clark Road south. And she very quickly, working with her brother and her sons, increased that to 80,000 acres in what is now Sarasota County. Going out to the Myakka River, she bought land from Garrett Murphy, who'd been raising cattle since the 1880s. She bought land down in Venice that the old pioneer families like the Heigls and the Roberts had owned for years. And she was buying up everything she could buy. And in fact, within 10 years, or let's just say 1921, when the county was created, the Palmers owned approximately 30% of all the acreage in Sarasota County. Now, if we take that back in time a little bit, what that'll tell you is, okay, she owned 30% of it in 1910, or let's say 1911 as well. And so she owned 30% of the 50% that we represented in Manatee County. She was paying a huge proportionate share of the taxes into Manatee County. By June of 1910, she had created two companies. One was called the Sarasota Venice Company, and that one was designed to develop real estate subdivisions downtown Sarasota, and run the various business buildings in downtown Sarasota, and also to manage all of the, Sarasota Venice Company was founded to manage all the land that they had purchased from Joseph Lord, all this stuff south of Clark. The Palmer, Florida Company was designed to manage their business dealings downtown, their residential subdivisions downtown, and their interests that they had on the Barrier Islands. So these two separate companies were chartered in June, just 4.5 months after she arrived. And then it was in December of 10 that she purchased all the cattle and ranch lands of Garrett Murphy, also called Dink Murphy was his nickname. When the local newspaper, when Rose Wilson interviewed Dink Murphy about him selling the 7,000 head of cattle that he had spent his whole life raising up from a small herd, his only quote was, "Say I've sold my stuff, that's enough." He sold out entirely, and then he got back in the cattle business again and started all over. And by December of 1910, that first year that Mrs. Palmer had come to Sarasota, she was entertaining royalty. In this case, Prince Kantakazi, who was a part of the Tsarist Russia royalty. And so she was doing her thing. And then within a year, she had convinced the Seaboard Airline Railroad to build the railroad tracks from Fruitville, where they had been extended in 1904, from Sarasota, where it had been extended in 1903. And so by 1912, we had the railroad down through Osprey, Laurel, Nokomis, and into Venice. And in fact, it's a whole nother story for a whole nother day, because I don't have time to talk about it today, but it was her putting the Venice station south of Venice that caused all the people in Venice who lived in Nokomis to get upset about it, and then they came up with the name Nokomis. But I can't tell you about that because we don't have time to talk about that today. All right, so that takes care of the purple pieces of paper that I scratched together before the meeting. Woo, Caitlin's breathing a sigh of relief. Now we'll go to the other sheets of paper I whipped up in the 5 minutes before the meeting. So, oh, just a few more things about 1910. So, we had our first automobile in 1909, Dr. Wilson, and then Dr. Joe Halton bought a car. Dr. Wilson bought an REO. That's founded by the guy who later did Oldsmobile, Random E. Olds. In fact, Oldsmar, Florida was his little development town up there on the north edge of old Tampa Bay. And then Joe Halton went and bought a Buick. And it was the doctors that bought these cars because they had to go out and make house calls. Nobody went to the doctor came to you, and they needed to have transportation. And so they retired their horses and they got automobiles. So anyway, Mrs. Palmer calls this meeting of the Board of Trade and kind of tells the men of the community how it's going to be. And from this point on, the ladies are in control. She's in control. Rose Wilson's in control. And they're going to take this place by storm. So some of the nucleus for creating Sarasota County started when they wanted better roads. They wanted better roads. They had cars. They didn't want to go through these sandy sugar sand trails where you got stuck all the time. And, so they kept petitioning Manatee County to build roads. And Manatee's like, hey, you get 1/5 of the money for roads and you spend it any way you want. And they did spend it well. They really did, but they needed more. And so there was a kind of a mass meeting held. And the business people in the community got together in 1913 and realized that the whole road building emphasis for Manatee County was focused on getting people out to Anna Maria Island. And they were building a bridge and they were putting all this money in. And that really upset the people in Sarasota. And so they had this first meeting and they talked about it, and they said that this was the point where the interests had diverged. In other words, we weren't one big county anymore. There was the north part of Manatee County, and then there was what they called South County, and that was the Sarasota district. And so once the people in Sarasota really came to realize that the interests had diverged, they kind of got busy. And then Harry Heigl, who was one of the two people that developed the northern end of Siesta Key and gave it the name Siesta. He had been born, his father had been one of the earliest pioneers in Venice. They had come from the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, moved to Venice. In 1885, 1886, Harry Heigl moved up to Sarasota about the same time that the colonists arrived from Scotland. And he created a little store there and ran the dock at the foot of Main Street. In any case, in 1914, he was like they called Harry Heigl Sarasota's indefatigable hustler. He was always promoting Sarasota, writing letters to people all over, creating brochures and sending them out, and just had a way with words in terms of convincing people that they had to move down here and make an investment, and that this was just the most beautiful place in the world, which of course it really was. And so Heigl calls a meeting in 1914, and this was supported very much by the Palmer family interest, who at that point held 50% of the taxable value. Okay, so I talked about them having 30% of the 50% of the Manatee County, but approximately 50% of the actual value, the taxes being paid, was being paid by the Palmers. And they wanted hard roads because they're developing all their citrus groves in Bee Ridge, and they're developing all the farming opportunities in the muckland soils of Fruitville, which was even preceding really the commercial exploitation of the mucklands in the Florida Everglades. It was happening at the same time when mucklands in Louisiana were being exploited for rice production. But it was very innovative to take this mucky soil that used to be sawgrass and drain it enough that you could grow celery and tomatoes and all these other things. So the people here decided that they were going to create their own bonding district, the state in an interest to have local counties be the ones responsible for building the roads. Instead of the state giving you money to build roads, they said, you can bond yourself, you can tax yourself for roads. So they created a law that allowed you to have a referendum or a vote to see if the community wanted to bond itself for roads. They'd borrow the money, build the roads, then pay that back over 10 or so years. So the people in Sarasota put forth a proposal to borrow $250,000 to build a hard road 1 lane wide between Sarasota and Venice. And that's That's that one Tamiami Trail section that I talked about, being here in 1921. And Manatee County, the Manatee County leaders kind of fought this tooth and nail, and they did it in very subtle and passive aggressive ways. That they had no choice but to allow the vote and the passage of this thing. But once it was approved by the public, they just drug their feet, and they kept rejecting the bids so that the work wouldn't take place. And then there started to be a little wondering on the part of the people in Sarasota, well, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? But finally, in the midst of, right before the outbreak of America's role in World War I, they finally let the bids to this company. The company gets like a third of the way through the project. They go bankrupt. The damn bonding entity went bankrupt, and the whole thing came to a grinding halt. Now you're in the middle of World War I. You got the flu pandemic that nobody's talking about, but people are dying left and right. And finally, after the war, they find another company to come along, muster up the money to finish that portion of the Tamiami Trail, those little paved sections out to Bee Ridge and Fruitville, and that bridge that I was talking about across to Siesta Key. So that all was kind of wrapped up around 1918. But boy, it left a bitter taste in the mouth of the Sarasotans, because they could have gotten a lot more bang for their buck had they been able to build all that before the war, So in June 16th of 1920, they held another mass meeting. Now, these mass meetings are fascinating to me because, you think about the way things are done in townships, up in Maine and Vermont, where they have these mass meetings and the people come together and decide what they're going to do in the community. Well, they had no government structure here. I mean, there were 1 out of 5 voices on the Manatee County Commission, but obviously that wasn't getting any traction. And it wasn't the fault of the commissioner representing the Sarasota district. Heck, they could get outvoted 4-1 every time. So they held another mass meeting, and this one was actually kind of called by the Palmer family. And it was held in the Palmer offices in downtown on Main Street in Sarasota. And Dr. Joe Halton, that guy who'd bought the second automobile, that old Buick in 1910, he kind of led off the meeting. And they talked about, the difficulties of working with the mother county, how hard it had been to get these roads built, and how if we can't control our own destiny, things just aren't going to happen. In fact, just give you an example, something like $350,000 in taxes for schools went to Manatee County in 1920, and then they gave the Sarasota district back $35,000. 1/10 of what went north came home. So that was frustrating people. So Joe Halton's famous quote, and you can read this in Dr. Cassell's book, is, "We can expect to get milked until we are dry." And so that was kind of the clamor call. And then just a few days later, they had another mass meeting, and Dr. Joe Halton presided at that one. And the Board of Trade at the time, the same group that 9 years before, Mrs. Palmer had gone and said, these are my plans, and you all need to get your act together. They got really smart. They went down to Inglewood. They went to Venice. They went to Osprey. They went to Bee Ridge. They went to Myakka and Fruitville. They went to Indian Beach. They went to a place called Minnesota, which was a timber company at the time. And they got everybody to come to the mass meeting up in Sarasota, and they appointed citizens from all those areas to be on the separation committee. Because at this point, what we're saying is we gotta separate. Now, an amazing thing happened. This was June 23rd of 1920, and William Tuttle, that engineer and surveyor who had been brought down by Mrs. Palmer to do all her surveying, had gotten word through the Surveyors Little Society that Bradenton was planning to bypass Sarasota with the Tamiami Trail. And Tamiami Trail, they wanted it to run east on Manatee Avenue down to Arcadia. And then that road from Arcadia would then connect down south to Miami, and that would be the Tamiami Trail, thereby cutting Sarasota completely out of the loop, which was kind of ironic, given that that Sarasota-Venice road that was completed right after World War I was actually the second portion of the Tamiami Trail to be built, the first one being up in Hillsborough County. So they could see that we were kind of getting ahead of them, and that what they were going to do about it was to pull one over on us and have that Tamiami Trail bypassed out to Arcadia. So when William Tuttle shared that with all the people at the mass meeting, everybody was mad. And so that really is when the emphasis came out that, you know, we're going to get cut out of the loop of prosperity here, and we got to take matters into our own hands. So then on September 7th of 1920, they had another mass meeting. This was the third mass meeting for the creation of the county. And this one was hosted by Arthur Britton Edwards, who was the real estate agent who was working with Joseph H. Lord, who had shown Mrs. Palmer the property here in Osprey and actually taken her to the old Jones cabin, which was the first parcel that she acquired when she started buying real estate down here. And it was also co-hosted by Augusta Wilson, who had been a state senator and who was one of the early pioneers of Mayaca, and who had been in Florida for his family had been here for 4 generations. And so Augusta Wilson with A.B. Edwards basically said, hey, we got 2 goals. Number one, Bradenton was asking all the people in Sarasota, Manatee County, let's say Manatee County was asking all the people in Sarasota to approve a road bond issue to build the new road to Arcadia. So if you can imagine the frustration, not only were they trying to bypass Sarasota and cut us out of the loop of prosperity, but they were going to make us pay for it. I mean, oh my gosh. So in any case, there were 2 goals: get people to vote no for the bond issue to bypass us, and to vote yes to back the idea of creating a new county. And so they really just had to squash that bypass road. So March of 1921, I think everybody kind of got lazy over the holidays. We could see nothing in the newspapers or anything else that anybody was talking about anything after that third mass meeting until in March of 1921, the Board of Trade reconstitutes itself and charters itself as the Chamber of Commerce, and for the first time ever allowed women to be a part of that. And so one of those women was Rose Wilson, and one was Alice Gunther, who was the wife of one of the employees of the Palmer, Florida company downtown. So there had the chamber engaged an attorney to draft up the bill to create Sarasota County. And local attorney W.Y. Perry reviewed all that paperwork and kind of blessed it and said, yeah, this is good, this is good. And then they decided to send Augusta Wilson, former senator, up to Tallahassee to pitch the bill in front of the legislature. And Gus said, no problem. This is going to be just easy as pie. Well, unbeknownst to Augusta Wilson, people on the Manatee River didn't feel that way. And Gus was friends with all those people. He couldn't imagine all of his friends voting against this. And yet the senator representing Manatee County was being backed by all the people in Bradenton. And so there was no way they were going to allow the creation of Sarasota County and take all of that taxable land away from the mother county. So they sent 200 telegrams to Tallahassee from Sarasota, 200 telegrams to the legislature to say, hey, you got to let this thing go. But it wasn't going to happen. So some members of the Chamber of Commerce kind of wised up and they said, look, let's go up to Bradenton and sit down with those folks and chat this thing out and talk it over. So they reached out to the leaders up in Bradenton and they scheduled another mass meeting for the whole public to come. And basically it was said, it's time for a frank conversation. So they went up there, and what they learned was that all they really needed to do to appease the Bradenton folks was to not include within the new county 4 townships that were out in the northeastern portion of the old Sarasota district. This would have included Mayaca City, Old Mayaca, little town called Tryon that's not there anymore, and the Florida East and West Coast Railroad, which ran out toward Arcadia. And what that did for Manatee was it allowed them to retain the route on their land for the road that they wanted to build to Arcadia. it also allowed them to still claim a portion of the luxurious and so highly valuable Myakka River grazing lands. And it also allowed them to be able to have a part of the Myakka River in their county. And so the Sarasota folks acquiesced to that. A lot of them weren't happy about it. Augusta Wilson said, hey, let them have it because you don't want to have to build that road. Let them build that road. And then the Palmer family said, look, if this is the way it's going to be, then we'll volunteer to build the Verna Road, which is still called Verna Road today. And it takes you from the terminus of Fruitville Road up to State Road 70 so you can go out to Arcadia. So the Palmer family committed to build that road. That would allow the Bradenton people to build their road to Arcadia, not be a part of the Tamiami Trail, but to build the road to Arcadia, would allow Sarasota to connect to that road, and it would get those 4 townships out of the new county. And once that was done, Bradenton said, we're not in your way anymore. So that was pretty cool. Now, here's the amazing thing, folks. It took like 40 years after Congress approved the money to dredge Little Sarasota Bay to get the dredging to happen. That's not the way the state legislature was working. They actually, this was approved by the legislature on May 11th of 1921. It was signed by Governor Kerry Hardee, who had just been put in office in January and had just signed another creation of a county, which named a county after him, Hardee County. So he was in a good mood. He was ready to sign off on some more counties. You know, he was getting famous from it. And so he signed the paperwork the next day on the 12th. And then that set the stage for an election to vote, let the people who were in the Sarasota district or who would be in the boundaries of the new county to vote on it. Originally, the folks in Bradenton wanted the entire Manatee County to vote on it. But again, at that frank conversation, they admitted that that really didn't make any sense. It needed to be the people that were going to have, you know, that new county and the new taxes and things like that. And oh, by the way, Augusta Wilson had kind of crunched all the numbers and had demonstrated to everybody that their taxes weren't going to go up. They were actually going to come down. At the same time, we'd get more improvements because they were such a donor to Manatee County. Again, like 5 to 10 times over donating what they got back. And so the election was held on June 15th. Rose Wilson in the newspaper was pushing the ladies to get out and vote, pushing other people to get out and vote. And the vote was approved with only one section of the county not voting it up, and that was actually Venice. For some reason, Venice, and I think there were some personality conflicts down there with some of the folks that were on the committee, and I think that was part of that. And you know, back in those days, people could very much influence others around them. And so then, you know, the official date that made it all official was July 1st. There was a big party the night before in Sarasota, and then there was a big parade the next day on Main Street. And Rose Wilson changed the masthead on her newspaper from the Sarasota Times to the Sarasota County Times, and everybody kind of celebrated the new county. So all the work is done, right? Woo! All the hard stuff is done, right? Wrong. That was the easy part, because the county was essentially a promise to the community, a promise that we build more schools and better schools, and maybe even pay the teachers in the schools. You know, that would be cool. And that we build more roads and we build more bridges, and that we would set up a government, and we would have fair taxation, and that we would be able to have elections, and we would have a sheriff, and we would have a court system, and all those things had to be set up. So really the proof of the pudding wasn't so much in getting the county created, it was in making the county function and fulfilling the promise, fulfilling the expectation. And there were challenges. So for instance, Manatee County, being the kind mother county that they were, said, look, you're halfway through a tax year, so why don't we just go ahead and collect the taxes for you, and then at the end of the year, we'll give you your share. Well, Sarasota agreed to that. They didn't have any way to split it down the middle in the middle of the year. So the taxes from that first year, I think it took 18 months after the close of that year for Manatee to finally give that money to Sarasota. So basically we had no income. We had no income because Manatee County took all the money and then they held it, and then they kind of let it start to trickle out. They wouldn't turn over the property tax records because they said they had to kind of reconcile them and do all this stuff. So they didn't turn those over. They were reluctant to turn over the court documents, all of the things held in the clerk's office, like the old plats that had been approved in this part of the area, and the rules that had been laid down, and the licenses that had been issued, and all these things. It wasn't like they said, we're not going to give you the books. They just didn't do it. And finally, it took, I think, almost 2 years before everything was kind of resolved in Sarasota. Maybe more like 18 months, actually, from the July 1st, but it took quite a while. And then also, just backing up a minute, you can imagine your county's created in July 1st of 1921. You don't have any money coming in. And now you get hit by the biggest hurricane to hit Florida in anybody's memory in October. And it wipes out downtown Sarasota, and it wipes out all the docks and the old Pagan House, everything that was down here in Spanish Point, and that was the big one. That was the big one. And for the volunteers at the downtown Sarasota campus, you have to understand that north of the Selby's, it was just dock after dock after dock with boathouses. And then where Ringling Boulevard terminates at the bay, it went out onto the railroad dock. The railroad went way out into the bay, and then they bring all the boxcars out there, and the fishermen would come and load all that fish into the boxcars and then take it over to where Northern Trust Bank is today, which is basically the Palmer family out of Chicago, by the way. And they'd load it up with ice, and then they'd take it all north to market. Well, the 1921 hurricane took out the railroad dock, it took out all those docks, and it completely changed the complexion of the waterfront. And then the community decided they didn't want those commercial docks there anyway, so they moved that all up to what's now the 10th Street boat ramp, what they called Payne Terminal. But I don't have time to tell you about that because that's not our topic today. So I didn't tell you about that because we didn't have time. So then when Sarasota finally did get their tax bills, there had been a miscalculation on the part of Manatee, so everybody freaked out because all their taxes went up, up, up. When Augusta Wilson said they go down, 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 so they had to go back and reassess it all, and they found the mistake, and then they got the correct tax bills out. So there was a period of time right after the creation of the county where it didn't look like the promise was going to get fulfilled, but indeed it did. So the governor appointed a set of commissioners for the area, and there was kind of somebody from all the different parts of the county. Some of the names, Frank Walpole. Frank Walpole actually had been at the governor's side when he signed the bill, and the governor Hardy gave the pen to Walpole, who brought it back to Sarasota County, and it's in the County History Center collection, the actual pen with a little ribbon on it that was used to sign the bill. A gentleman named Lawrence May, who was with the Palmer Company, Frank Hayden, who was a resident in Nokomis, who actually had no role in the creation and might have been one of those people who voted against it. Pete Buchan from the Inglewood area, and Henry Hancock from Myakka. Those were the first commissioners. And then Augusta Wilson, who had been the champion of pushing this thing through the legislature. He became the first tax collector. And those were some of the functions. Thomas Yarbrough, who was the superintendent of schools, became the first superintendent of schools. W.Y. Perry, who had reviewed over all the legal documents, became the first judge. And O.E. Resch became the first clerk of the courts. And he had been an assistant at the Manatee County Court office. So it was kind of interesting. That actually helped when they appointed him to be the clerk down here. At least there was a connection there. Anyway, Joseph H. Lord, who had started all this back in the 1890s, was the first state representative for Sarasota. We were given a seat in the legislature for our new county. And Charles Strohmeyer became the tax assessor. And the first sheriff actually just stayed in place a couple of weeks. And then B.D. Levy, and then Hodges, I believe, became the sheriff after that. So I think it was Walpole who went up to the state, got some surplus equipment from the state road department. He got 2 Ford trucks. He got 2 Dodge trucks. He got 2 motorcycles with sidecars. He got a 1-ton cement mixer, and he got a Caterpillar tractor. And that's how they were going to build the roads. They weren't going to hire a contractor and have the contractor go bankrupt with all their money. They were going to build them themselves. So they also bought a road grader from the Palmer family for $250, which they said was just, bargain basement. And they even loaned some of that equipment to Charlotte County to help extend the Tamiami Trail, because the way the Tamiami Trail used to run was, again, kind of down, kind of along the way it runs now. And it ran all the way to Inglewood. And then it hooked around Inglewood and it came up what we would now call River Road. And then it crossed the Myakka River just south of where the 41 bridge is. And it went straight up to Warren Mineral Springs, I think on San Juan, I think is the name of the street. Actually, they had the asphalt plant at Warren Mineral Springs, and then it hooked around and it went down to Punta Gorda. And so once it left the Sarasota County, they went ahead and sent the equipment down there and helped Charlotte County build their part of it because they were trying to get it down to Fort Myers and then ultimately across the course to Miami, hence the name Tamiami Trail. The 1922 slogan, by the way, of the Chamber of Commerce was the completion of the Tamiami Trail. That was like their biggest thing. And so let's see. In 1922, they got a whole bunch more equipment. And then the Palmers started selling them shell. They started digging shell up out of the ground, which was, part of the work that they were doing to dredge out the canals to further develop the Palmer farms. And so when they would get into these layers of shell, old ancient, 10 million year old shell, they contributed a lot of that. In March of 1922, the Trailblazers started doing their thing, to get all the way down to Miami. The biggest difficulty, of course, was getting across the Everglades. And the state ran out of money and it just wasn't going anywhere. And Baron Collier, who was in Naples, basically said, hey, I'll build the rest of the road. You got to name a county for me. So that's why he got Collier County. And he built the road. Collier County is a huge county. And just a little trivial fact, Baron Collier's the guy who, and this is a kind of a nationwide thing, he's the first person to think that maybe we needed to paint a line down the middle of the road. That might be a good idea. So that was his idea, and that's what they did. So, and by the way, the Trailblazers that made it all the way across the Everglades, I mean, if you can only imagine, with your Model T, this is basically what people had. They had some Buicks and other cars, but it was just swamp. And they had Seminole Indians as their guides. And the first person to make it across was a fellow named George Prime, who was a hardware store owner in Sarasota, who'd been a part of the original Good Roads movement, had been a part of the Sarasota-Venice Road District, had been a part of the committee to create Sarasota County. And here he was, champion, we're going to get this road all the way to Miami. So that was pretty cool. That's about it. From there, what happened? Well, Sarasota County was created just in time for a little thing called Florida real estate boom. And by 1921, the same year county was created, the city of Sarasota said, we don't have any place for the visitors to stay. All the houses are filled, the little hotels are filled. They gave a guy, Andrew McCanch, out of Chicago, no taxes, free water, free power, no bills, to build a Miramar Hotel downtown on Palm Avenue. He built it in 60 days. He built an apartment complex. And then in another 90 days, he built a hotel complex. And he worked crews on 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day. And they built that thing overnight to accommodate all the people because people were a-coming. Everybody was advertising outside of Florida. Real estate values were doubling and tripling within a matter of weeks. And so people were just flooding Florida to take advantage of that. Subdivisions were popping up everywhere. Automobiles are choking out the streets. John Ringling's developing the islands there, the Ringling Isles, the St. Armands, the Lido Key, the Ritz-Carlton on Longboat Key. His brother Charles is pushing things to the east and donating land for a county courthouse and building bank buildings and hardware stores, and talked the Atlantic Coastline Railroad into building their station there. Now we got 2 railroads in Sarasota. We got people pouring down here, tens of thousands of people coming down to Sarasota for the season, and the boom is on. And 1926 hurricane hits Miami. Lake Okeechobee overflows. People, masses of people are killed. There was no communication with the outside world. Northern newspapers reported everybody in South Florida killed by the hurricane, and nobody came to visit in 1927, and it was the end of the boom. 2 years before the stock market crash, this place was dead. And so Sarasota County was created just in time. And since then, Sarasota County has continued to do what Sarasota County does, tax people for the improvements that they want. And so one of the things that, the voters every couple of years are asked to approve millages for school improvements or park improvements, library improvements, these sorts of things, acquisition of environmental land, acquisition of park land, all these sorts of things. And so that's how Sarasota County was created. And to kind of bring it all home, especially for those who have kind of a lot of heart and soul in this place we call historic Spanish Point campus, none of this would have happened if it weren't for Mrs. Palmer's arrival. Mrs. Palmer's arrival was the pivotal point that caused people to realize that Sarasota had potential beyond anything that they had ever dreamed. And that from that point forward, we were going to be in charge of our own destiny. We weren't going to get cut out of the loop of prosperity by people who were jealous of us up at the Manatee River. Now, truth be told, I don't want to make it sound like there was this huge rivalry, between the people, because it was really just over that little road that they wanted to build to cut us out. And the people in Sarasota and the people, Frank Guptill here at Spanish Point was friends with all these people up on the Manatee River. He was building all their boats for them. Augusta Wilson had known all these people. They were all customers of his store in Mayaca. Everybody was friends, but there was some shenanigans going on there. And Sarasota County was created to straighten that out. And one of the things that I shared, I think I shared it. I was recently asked to talk about this subject for the Sarasota Tiger Bay Club. And I mentioned how you have to be careful how you treat the people in the south part of the county. Because when you get to the point where your county actually has a north and a south county, that might mean that you got to pay more attention to those people, because what happened in Manatee County when they didn't pay attention to the people in the south county is they created their own county. So anybody from Venice and Inglewood, hear me now, you have strength that you're not even aware of. So I think at that point, I have exhausted my scratch notes, and I will take a few questions, and let's see how we're going to manage that.
So it looks like we have one from Sandra, John, that she's asking, what cities or towns are in Escambia County?
It's like St. Johns River area. St. Johns River area. You got to write down the name of this person who just asked this question, because I owe them a prize, because, oh my gosh, a question I can't answer. Oh my gosh, I owe this person a prize. I think I'm going to give him one of Frank's books. Yeah, you get a Frank book. I see a question here from Allison Bishop. Governor Sidney Katz, not Cass. That's correct. Katz, C-A-T-T-S. And you can look it up on Wikipedia and check them out. Any other questions? Let me ask you this, because I can't see anyone. Do we have anybody on the Zoom today?
We do. We have plenty of people on the Zoom.
All
if
right.
Anybody has any questions, go ahead and either put them in the Q&A. Oh, here we go. Brian Smith is asking, any hope for any centennial
Pensacola is Escambia. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I was in the wrong part. I definitely owe a book to that person.
We'll make sure she gets it. Brian Smith asked if there's any hope for any centennial events this year.
Well, there's a committee that's been planning events for 2 years, and they're having to kind of change direction on a lot of the events. The libraries are going to be doing quite a few programs. I'm working on a program that's going to talk about what was going on with the Selby family and the Palmer family at that point in time. And then there's a committee that's working on some historical markers. There's a committee working on possibility of a caravan from Sarasota to Venice to kind of recreate the old Tamiami Trailblazers. Unfortunately, COVID has shut down all the big events that were planned. The Sarasota County is going to kick off in March. They're going to do a celebration up at the courthouse. They've historically designated that. They're going to put up a plaque. Greater Sarasota Chamber of Commerce has done a mural on their building. They're getting ready to do another one. Venice Chamber's got some things up their sleeve. Some of the folks in the community kind of came up with the idea of 100 days for 100 years. And so most of the stuff's going to kick off in March and then run through July. So I see another question. Can we talk about what the Palmer brothers did after their mother's death? We actually have an entire program about that. It was one of the first programs that I offered for the volunteers. I think maybe what we should do is redo that one for an upcoming program, because it's really fascinating. no sooner had Bertha passed away that the brothers got exceptionally busy trying to fulfill her dreams down here. The visitors, her friends kept coming to visit. The home farm kept operating. The magazines kept coming from the north to tour the gardens. You know, Honore and Potter Palmer focused on the development of the Palmer farms, getting all the sawgrass drained. Then later, the creation of Myakka River State Park. And so, yeah, we've got a whole program that was requested by the Spanish Point volunteers on those future generations of the Palmer family. And just to put this in perspective, the great-great-granddaughter of Bertha Palmer is the current board chair of Maurice Selby Botanical Gardens. Okay, Pauline Wamsler. She is the great-great-granddaughter of Mrs. Potter Palmer. So there's still a connection there. All right, we got to thank you to Caitlin and John for a wonderful lecture. We got to thanks for being here. Hope to see you again. I think we're wrapping up time-wise, but folks, we'll bring back that Palmer Next Generation program. And I hope that you enjoyed our program today. And I'm sorry I didn't spend more time preparing for it, but I only had about 15 minutes. So I hope it was okay. And maybe next time we'll do some pictures. Thanks.
John, do you have time for one more question?
I sure do.
One more. Where did Bertha Palmer get her money to purchase the her acreage, her original acreage?
Well, you know, her family were aristocrats in France when they came to America. They were amongst the first settlers of Kentucky. Her father was one of the wealthiest people in Kentucky. When he moved to Chicago, he was one of the most wealthy people in Chicago. And at a party at the Honore Mansion, at the age of 13, Bertha met Potter Palmer. And Potter Palmer met Bertha and fell in love. But 13 was a little too young, so they waited until she was 21 when they were married. And of course, Potter Palmer had extensive real estate development. He was, you know, built the Palmer House Hotel, gave it to Bertha as their wedding gift, and then it burned. And then he built the stone castle, started in 1885, Lakeshore Drive, developed all Lakeshore Drive. Lakeshore Drive was a marsh. It was nothing. And he moved the entire social center north and sold all that property, which the mansion was supposed to cost $90,000 to build. By the time his wife got done telling the architect what she wanted, by the time the bills got to $1 million, he said he stopped counting. Please don't see this as disrespectful, but I'll just use these two other anecdotes. Potter Palmer was at a party one night and his wife walked by and he says to the fella next to him, "There goes $250,000 worth of jewelry." When he was putting his will together, his attorneys kept saying, "Don't leave anything to Bertha. You know, she's so young, she's going to get married and all that money will go to her husband." And Potter Palmer said, "He's gonna need it." So there was tremendous wealth in both families. What's interesting is Potter Palmer dies in 1902, and she and her brother, Adrian, and sons multiplied that fortune multitude of times over, which is fascinating. Women were not allowed to inherit all the money from a husband. She was only allowed to inherit half, and the other half was put in the trust of the two sons. That's a whole nother program, and I didn't have time to tell you any of that stuff today. All right, so here's just a comment from someone. They spent a lot of time in Chicago. Now they're living in Palmer Ranch. What a connection that is. And Allison, I appreciate your laughing out loud to my straight face jokes. I do appreciate that. All right, folks, have a fantastic weekend. Caitlin will tell me when I'm up again, and I'll dream up another program for you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for being here. Thanks, John.
You bet.